At long last, we have made it to the final entry in the Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster, and that is, of course, Final Fantasy VI, which is a fan favorite and was originally known as Final Fantasy III on the Super Nintendo over here in the West. Final Fantasy VI is renowned for not only being one of the best Final Fantasy games of all time, but also one of the best in the Super Nintendo library, which is an incredibly impressive feat when you consider that the Super Nintendo library is stacked with excellent games, many of which are now considered classics, and you don't even need to wear nostalgia blinders to think that. Anyway, Final Fantasy VI can really be viewed as a capstone of sorts to the previous 5 mainline games because it takes many of the best ideas and the best design choices from the previous 5 games to create an experience here that is as unique as it is memorable. To be clear, that's not to say that the previous 5 games are incomplete or less developed than Final Fantasy VI, but rather that 6 can be seen as a very nice swan song of the Final Fantasy series, saying goodbye to its 16-bit 2D era beginnings that it had before it launched into the 3D era with the release of Final Fantasy VII some 3 years later. Alright, that's enough of a history lesson. I'll get the gameplay of 6 out of the way quickly because it plays very similarly to the previous 5 games. This is a simple JRPG featuring abilities and equips. We also have espers now, which are a major component, which they function essentially as summons. Also, I'll briefly address something that might be a minority complaint here, and that is I don't think that the sprite work and the color palette works very well in this Pixel Remaster version. It looks a little bit worse than the Super Nintendo version. I don't know, it's kind of hard to describe without citing to something specific, but it just seems to me that maybe like the brightness is tuned too highly. I don't know, it's not a big deal, but it's definitely noticeable. Let's talk about the characters because there are many in this game. First, and I should have actually mentioned this a few moments ago, is that each party member also has a special command that adds a little bit of variety to how each party member is controlled and how they affect the battlefield. While they're not super defining, they are unique enough, which is good and adds a little bit of variety to combat, like I said. However, there's definitely a split between the good characters and the not as good characters, both in terms of their story relevance as well as their combat ability. Obviously, Terra, Edgar, and Teles, for example, are all good in both categories, whereas characters like Gao, the Yeti Umaru, and even secondary mainstays like Realm are just not as good, useful, or interesting. I wouldn't go as far to say that the not as good characters are straight bad, but they are definitely just sort of there for padding out the bench, so to speak. The game does, however, at multiple points force you to split the cast into different parties, which makes it feel like all of the characters are working together to complete a shared task or goal. Also, I really like the relationship that slowly builds over time between Locke and Celes, and Celes is actually probably my favorite character from this game. She reminds me a lot of Celica from Fire Emblem Shadows of Valentia, both of them being spell swords or some sort of equivalent. I've never been a huge Terra fan, but she's okay, but good lord, if the males in this game don't actively flirt with her, they absolutely coddle her about everything instead. And as for our villains, Kefka is legitimately insane. He acts like a true chaotic evil would, and he's a fun villain for that. In many cases, he's just a more developed Joker from most iterations of Batman. I think what makes Final Fantasy VI so loved is that, in addition to its well-developed and memorable characters, the game has a litany of memorable events as well. For one, the Phantom Train sequence is still so cool and unique despite how brief it is. I also personally thought that the Solitary Island sequence with Celes is great and is actually really emotional. She even tries to attempt to end her own life but fails, and it's one of the more moving things in the Final Fantasy games and maybe video games as well. Anyway, the big landmark event occurs when a literal cataclysm befalls the world after the warring triad are separated, and it's really, really cool, and it really feels like, as the player, you've been kind of underestimating how high the stakes actually were and how dire the consequences were until the worst actually does happen. But immediately after that, the game unfortunately devolves into a big find your friends mission and make a few new ones along the way, with all of these being varying levels of cool or uninteresting, and it consumes almost half the game for about 10 to 15 hours, and I just feel like the pacing could have been allocated better here. That said, I really enjoyed the ending sequence where everyone is helping one another out to escape as Kefka's tower collapses. During this ending sequence is one of the most moving events in the game, and that's when Shadow makes his ultimate decision. Whatever his reasoning, I remember being heartbroken about his fateful decision when I was younger, but as I have aged and lived through my own experiences, I have to say I'm much more sympathetic to Shadow's plight, and ultimately, that's a sign of good, timeless writing. Okay, on a less emotional level, let's try to finish this review because it's going to be way over 4 minutes at this point. I do want to take a moment to go on a tangent to say, and I've said this before, and I will continue to say it again and again, is that the digital-only future that we were promised is not what it's supposed to be. We were promised that digital-only meant that games were going to be cheaper, and yet here they are not. Case in point, the Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster on disc or on the Switch cartridges often on discount to about $45 or so from most of the major retailers, whereas it's still priced at $75 on the Nintendo eShop as well as the PlayStation and Microsoft storefronts. So my question is, what gives? All of that said, though, $75 isn't an egregious price for 6 games, but Final Fantasy VI is the gem of the collection, and I do think that the game is worth the $12.50. There's no doubt that Final Fantasy VI is a very good game and a Final Fantasy classic, but I will admit that I'm still partial to the Super Nintendo version over this one for probably nostalgic reasons, I'll admit, but this version still earns a very respectable B+/A-. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll be pivoting to something a little bit different on the next one.